Now, for RCT, for the assessment of RCT, the most widely used tool is so-called risk of bias tool. The first version was developed in 2008. Okay, and the paper on this that explains how to use this tool was published in BMJ in 2011. So if you want to know the details, you can download this paper. Okay, and then in 2019, the same group, so based on the feedback from some maybe readers, maybe methodological experts, etc., they updated the first version. So this is so-called risk of bias 2, okay, the version 2. And introduction and very detailed explanations and training webinars can be found here. But, you know, in my view, I always prefer the first version because it's simpler. The second version, let me show you maybe. So the updated version, there is also a paper published in BMJ explaining how to use this tool. Okay, how was this tool developed and how to use this tool. And there is an appendix of this paper explaining how you do the assessment step by step according to the risk of bias tool version 2. But it's very complicated. Indeed, it's very comprehensive, okay, but so comprehensive that only a few people know how to do it. I don't know. I haven't tried it. Okay. So you see, this appendix alone is 30 pages long. Okay. So it's really demanding for you guys, for beginners. It's also demanding for me. I mean, it's really difficult and time consuming. So I personally always prefer the first version. And so far, okay, it's still acceptable to use the first version. I mean, for many journals, it's still acceptable. No one will challenge you. Okay, so that's why in this workshop, I will focus on the first version. And the other reason that I prefer the first version is that, like I said earlier, quality assessment is always a subjective judgment, right? Always subjective. So no matter how complex, how comprehensive you are, like risk of bias 2, this version 2, okay, indeed it's more comprehensive, but still it's subjective. Still people make mistakes, right? And this version 2 includes much more items, much more questions when they are doing the assessment. So the more items you include, the more questions you ask, that means the more likely you're going to make mistakes. And the more likely different reviewers are going to disagree with each other. So many components there, right? So what is the benefit? Still, it's a subjective process. Still, people disagree. So why do we do it? That's my argument, okay? You know, in fact, recently, I mean, 2 weeks ago, my colleague went to an international conference on evidence-based medicine. And one of the topic is about these two, risk of bias version 2. Some of the most influential researchers in this field, actually, they don't like this one. They criticize this version 2 radically, okay? So I heard from my colleague that they don't like this too because it's too complicated, okay? So that's another reason why I'll focus on the version 1 in this workshop. So this is version 1. It's only a table, okay? A single table. So in this table, the first column is the so-called bias domain, okay? What kind of bias it's looking at, okay? What kind of bias it wants to assess, including this, selection bias, performance bias, detection bias, etc. And all of them can be categorized into like selection bias or information bias or confounding bias, just different names, okay? And this is the source of bias. So which procedure or which step will, in which step of the RCT will this bias occur? For example, in the random sequence generation, in this step, there may be some imbalance between the two groups, and that may lead to confounding bias. In fact, I thought this name, selection bias, is not appropriate. The more appropriate name for the random sequence generation is confounding bias. For allocation concealment is selection bias, but that's another issue. Okay, very a more difficult issue to discuss. So, but anyway, you keep in mind that in RCT there are 7 different sources of bias. From the beginning, from the random sequence generation to allocation concealment, to the blinding of participants and an outcome assessor, and to the reporting of the results. So there could be different bias. Okay, so what you need to do is first extract the data, extract the description of these procedures from the paper. So in last workshop, data extraction, I mentioned that for quality assessment, you need to extract these data or information or texts, right, from the papers. So let's say for random sequence generation, you just copy and paste what is reported in the paper. Okay, and this will be the basis for your judgment. And then based on this description information, each review author, maybe 2 of you, maybe 3 of you, will make a judgment whether there is high risk of bias or low risk of bias or unclear risk of bias for this domain. And similarly for other domains. So for each domain, you have a judgment, right? And then, so you make a judgment, and then after that, based on the judgment of each domain, you can draw a so-called summary assessment for the whole study. Let me give an example. So this assessment is conducted by I think it's by a Cochrane review. So the topic maybe is about what is the topic? Oh, it's not mentioned here. Doesn't matter, but it's I think it's about a therapeutic drug assessment. Okay, drug efficacy evaluation. Okay, so the authors evaluated one of the studies in this way. So for the random sequence generation, for this domain, for this source of bias, the description from the primary study, from the primary paper is like this. They just copy and paste and quote, randomization was 1:1 with a block of size 6. So this is the so-called block randomization, right? It's not individualized randomization. It's a block randomization, which is fine. And then the list of randomization was obtained using the SAS, which is a software, you know, right? SAS procedure plan at the Data Statistical Analysis Center. So that means this is generated by computer software, and it's the recommended way, right? So that means for this part, the authors of the RCT did it very well. Okay, it's a computer generated random sequence. Good. So the authors, the reviewers' judgment for this domain is that there is low risk of bias because it did it very well, right? In the recommended way, low risk of bias. And then for the second domain, allocation concealment. So the primary study didn't provide any detailed information about allocation concealment. So the reviewers' authors commented that the randomization list was created at the Statistical Data Center, but further description of allocation is not included. So in the primary paper, no mention of details of this issue. So the systematic reviewers' judgment is that the risk of this domain is unclear because there is no basis for the judgment, right? So it's unclear. Okay, now bear in mind that unclear is not something in between low and high. It could be high, could be low. You don't know. Okay, many people think, oh, unclear risk means it's median risk of bias. No, it's not true. It could be low, could be high. You don't know. Okay. So it's another separate category. And the third domain, blinding of participants and researchers. So this is about performance bias. So the trial being evaluated is actually an open label trial. Open, what does it mean? Open label means that everyone, the researchers, the patients, all of them know who is in which group. Okay, So each participant clearly knows that, oh, he or she is in the intervention group or in the control group. It's known to all people, open label. And this may cause, like, this knowledge may affect the intervention or behavior of patients. It may affect the behavior of the caring physicians. And it may also affect the reporting of outcomes. Let's say, for example, one of the outcomes in this RCT is a subjective outcome. For example, quality of life. So it's a subjective thing, right? When you are reporting your quality of life, it really depends on how you feel about it, right? Your feeling. So if it's open label, if you know you are in the treatment group or you are in the placebo group, that may affect your reporting. You're in the treatment group, so maybe, oh, I'm receiving treatment, so I feel that I'm much better than before. But maybe actually there's no difference. Okay, it's sort of like the placebo effect, right? Something like that. So open label trial may affect the performance of or the behavior of participants and researchers, and also the outcome assessment. This is particularly true for subjective outcome. Later, I'll give you an example. If the outcome is objective, for example, mortality or death, that will not be affected. Okay. So your knowledge about which group you are in will not affect the mortality outcome, right? And also, if it's an objective outcome like blood glucose or the size of tumor, okay, this kind of objective outcome will not be affected by the knowledge because you cannot control that objective outcome, right? It's kind of biological thing. It's not subjective. Okay, so open label is not always bad. For objective outcome, it's not a big issue, but for subjective outcome, really it can affect the performance and also the reporting of patients. Okay. The fifth domain is called incomplete outcome data. So also it's related to attrition bias, and this bias mainly arises from lost follow-up. So some people lost follow-up. That means the outcome data you have is incomplete because you don't know what happened to those lost people, right? So if there is a large proportion of people lost follow-up, then this issue, attrition bias, will be significant. Okay, so to address this issue, you may need to check whether the primary study adopted the so-called intention to treat analysis. So ideally, this is the recommended way to do it. Okay, you should, even if some people lost the follow-up, you should still include all of them in the data analysis. Okay, and that can help you reduce the impact of lost follow-up to some extent. So if there is a lot of lost follow-up and if the primary study didn't do any intention to treat analysis, then there will be high risk of bias. Okay, but in this study being evaluated, the lost follow-up is not that much. Only 5 of them lost follow-up and were excluded. So the review authors consider that, oh, this issue is not a big one. So I mean, they acknowledge that there is some lost follow-up and there is a problem, but this problem is not that significant. Okay, so that's why eventually they give it a low risk of bias. The final judgment is low risk of bias. And then selective reporting. Like I said, selective reporting is about whether the pre-specified outcomes are all reported. Okay, so in some papers, they said that they're going to investigate like 5 outcomes in the methods section, but somehow in the results section, they only reported the data of 3 outcomes. The other 2 missing. No one knows why. Okay, and that will be an issue. So in this trial being evaluated, there is no selective reporting, so the risk of bias for this domain is also low. And the last one is other bias, any other issue arising from the conduct of the primary study. Okay. So for this particular trial, there is no description of the uptake of other recommendations or other measures, so which the review authors think is important for the topic. Okay, so they think this issue is important, but the primary study didn't describe anything about it. So they assign a rating of unclear risk for this domain. Okay, so this is the rating, the judgment for each domain. So you see there are, for some domains, it's low risk of bias. For some of them, there are high risk of bias. For two of them, there are high unclear risk of bias, right? So for this particular study, the summary assessment, I think, will be high risk because two of them are a high risk of bias. Okay, now you may wonder how to draw a summary assessment for each study. Okay, and also for all the trials together. Now, this is the principles, the rules for drawing summary assessment. There is actually no gold standard, no very specific rule. Okay, but just some general principles. So when should you give a low risk of bias to a whole study? Okay, there are 7 domains. Some are low risk of bias, some are unclear risk. So how do you make the summary assessment? If for all of the key domains, there is low risk of bias, then with no doubt, you can give a summary assessment of low risk of bias to this study. Okay. And if you have 10 RCTs included in the systematic review, and if most information from these 10 RCTs are at low risk of bias, then you can also assign a so-called low risk of bias to the whole body of evidence. Okay, so when do you give a rating of unclear risk of bias? You can give it when there is low or unclear risk of bias for all key domains. Okay, none of the domains is at high risk of bias. Okay, they are either low or unclear risk, and then you can give this rating unclear risk of bias to the study. And similarly, for all of the trials together, if most information is at low or unclear risk of bias, you can give it a rating of unclear risk of bias. Okay, so when do you give a rating of high risk of bias? When there is high risk of bias for one or more key domains. So this is the general principle that how you make summary assessment. Okay, and then this is the way how you present the results of risk of bias assessment. So in this example, published in BMJ, there are more than 10 RCTs included, right? 1, 2, 3, maybe 12 or 13 trials, RCTs included. So you see each row here represents an individual RCT. So let's say for this one, the first one conducted by Bolt and colleagues. So there are 7 domains, right? For 6 of the domains, they are at low risk of bias. But for this one, allocation concealment, this domain is at high risk of bias. Okay, so this is for the first study. For the second study, conducted by Dadwell et al. Dadwell and colleagues, these 6 domains are at low risk of bias. The last one, other bias, is unclear. Okay, so this is the results of these 2 studies, and similarly, you can have the results of other studies. So overall, I mean, taken all these 12 or 13 trials together, you will see that for a few of the studies, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for more than half of the studies, there is high risk of bias, right? So overall, what is the summary assessment of the whole body of evidence? So if I were the authors, I may give a high risk of bias rating to the whole body of evidence. Okay. So this is how you do the assessment and how you present the results. For for the assessment of these kind of studies is much more complicated because there's much more bias in these studies than in RCT. Okay, and this is the first reason. There's much more bias. The other reason is that there are so many tools developed by different people for assessing observational studies, and there is no gold standard. It's not like RCT. For RCT, we have risk of bias too, right? But for observational studies, no gold standard. Different people use different tools, and also for different topics, you may need to use different tools. Okay, so that's why it's so complicated. I remember many years ago, there was a systematic review of the currently available tools for assessing observational study. And they identified more than 60 different scales, different checklists for the assessment. Okay, so it's very, very complicated. But now some of them, among these tools, some are used more often than others. For example, the so-called Newcastle-Ottawa Scale, NOS. This one has been adopted by many systematic reviews to assess the quality of cohort study and case control study. Okay, although many of them use it in the wrong way, in my view. Okay, I will show you later why it is not appropriate. And so for you, if you want to do a systematic review of cohort study or case control study, you may consider this one because at least it was used by many other people, right? So you can justify your choice by citing previous studies. Oh, the other people also used it before, right? And for cross-sectional study of prevalence, you may use this one, AHRQ2, for assessing cross-sectional study. I think you can Google search this tool. But in recent years, there is another tool which I think may gain more popularity, as this tool, so-called Robbins E, was developed by the group of experts who developed ROB2, risk of bias 2. Okay, so because this tool was developed by these people, maybe I think in the future it will gain more popularity. But again, this tool is very complicated. The manual for using this tool is 70 pages long. 70 pages long. It's a book. Okay, so I think it's too complicated to use. I mean, especially for you guys, beginners, right? So I'm not going to introduce these two in this workshop. I will focus on the Newcastle-Ottawa Scale to illustrate the rationale of assessing observational studies. Okay, so like I said, there is no gold standard, and each tool has its limitations. So for Robbins E, for this new tool, it's very comprehensive, and in theory, it's better, but nobody knows how to use it. That's the limitation, right? Each one has its limitation. And sometimes you may need to modify an existing scale or score or tool, or you may need to combine the suitable items, the good items of different tools to create a new one. Okay, I'll show you an example from my old study. Now, no matter which tool you're going to use, actually, you're always assessing the three categories of bias: information bias, selection bias, and confounding bias, right? So no matter which tool you're going to use, or whether you are going to create a new tool by yourself, you always need to consider this issue. Number one, if applicable, are the study subjects representative? For example, if you are doing a systematic review of cross-sectional study, for cross-sectional study of prevalence, representativeness is of paramount importance, right? So you need to make sure that the subjects are representative. Ask this question, and then examine the sampling procedure, the sampling method of the primary study, whether it's a random number sampling, right? If the study was based on clinical patients, whether the patients are so-called consecutive patients or not, consecutive cases, okay? If not, there could be a problem. And then the second question, if there is any exposure, for example, if you're doing a cohort study, comparing this exposure and reference group, okay, how is the exposure measured? Is it accurate or not? Because this is related to information bias, right? If it's like, if it's self-reported, then maybe it's not that accurate. But if it's ascertained through like medical examination or medical records, maybe it's more accurate, right? So the rating for the rating given to different methods is different. And how is the outcome measured is also related to information bias, right? Any measures taken to reduce observer bias or measurement bias, any missing data, and how is it dealt with, so on and so forth, right? So it's always about selection, information, and confounding bias, okay? Now, like I said, one of the tools that has been adopted by many systematic reviews is called the Newcastle-Ottawa Scale. It's used to assess the quality of cohort and case control study. So this tool, similar to other tools, also focuses on three aspects. One is the selection of participants. Is it representative? Is the exposure group and non-exposure group comparable? And how is the exposure ascertained? Is it accurate or not? Right? This is related to information bias. And whether some participants already have the outcome at the beginning. I mean, ideally for cohort study, nobody should have the outcome at baseline, right? Because for cohort study looks at the incidence of disease, the risk of the disease in the future. So at baseline, nobody should have the outcome, should have the disease, right? So if some of the participants already have the disease, the answer to this question will be no, right? You should not give a score, give a mark to this question. And the second component is comparability. You know, for case control study or cohort study, the most important goal is to get the estimate of effect, risk ratio or odds ratio. That's the most important thing, right? You want to assess the association between exposure and outcome. So in my view, this one is the most important among the three components, among selection, comparability, and outcome. This one, comparability, I think is the most important thing. So it's mainly related to confounding bias, whether the two groups are comparable, right? Whether the characteristics of patients or participants are balanced between the two groups. So, but somehow, you know, only 2 marks are given to this domain. So to answer this question, first, you need to examine whether the primary study controls for some of the most important factor, maybe, for example, age, sex. And then the second part is whether the study also controls other important confounders. If yes, if the study tries its best and controlled for maybe more than 10 or 20 confounders, then you can give 2 asterisk to these components. Okay, and the third component is outcome. How was the outcome assessed? How was it ascertained? Self-reported, or linkage to medical record, or independent blind assessment by a group of researchers or experts? Okay, so if the answer is A or B, you can give a asterisk to this question. And how long was the follow-up? Was it long enough for the disease to occur? Let's say for cohort study, okay? Cohort study looks at the incidence of disease, right? For example, cardiovascular disease. For cardiovascular disease, usually it takes several years to occur, 5 years or 10 years. If the follow-up is only like 6 months, then it's not long enough for the disease to occur, right? So maybe in both groups, there is only a few people who have developed the disease. And if you compare the two groups, you will find, oh, there is no significant difference, right? But that result could be wrong, okay? Because they haven't got enough time to develop the disease. So in this case, the result is not that reliable, right? And you should give you should not give a mark to this question. The answer is no, here is B, right? And also the adequacy of follow-up of cohorts. For example, it's basically about the rate of lost follow-up. So, and this rate, the threshold is always subjective. So in my study, sometimes I will set the threshold at 20%. If the rate of lost follow-up is lower than 20%, oh, then we will give it a mark. We think it's good. But if the rate of lost follow-up is very high, like 60%, 70%, then the answer is no. No, the answer is C. Okay, very low. Or maybe there is no statement. Okay, so something like that. The highest possible score for the NOS scale, for the Newcastle-Ottawa scale, the highest possible score is 9. So you can see there are 8 questions. But for this question, for comparability, you can give up to 2 scores, 2 asterisks to the study. Okay, so the highest possible score is 9. Now, a common but improper ways to use the results of Newcastle-Ottawa scale is this one. Okay, many people, based on the results, they will classify the primary studies into 2 or 3 categories: high quality or low quality, or high, medium, low quality. How do they do it? Many people would define high quality as 7 scores or above. Okay, so the total score is 9, right? If a study gets like 7 score, 8 score, and 9 score, then they will consider it's high quality. But this is not always true. Okay, even a study gets 7 score or 8 score, still it could be a poor quality study. For example, a study is doing very well in all the other items except this one, except the comparability. Okay, so for other items, the study gets 4 marks and plus 3 marks is 7 marks, right? It seems quite high. But maybe the study does not control any confounders, or only controls for 1 or 2 confounders. Okay, but all the other important confounders, they are not controlled in the study. In that case, I think it's still a poor quality study. Because for observational study, like I said, the most important goal is the association between the 2 groups, right? And to get an accurate estimate of the association, confounding is most important. But now you didn't control any confounding, or minimally controlled, or it's only minimally controlled. In this case, I think it's still a poor quality study. Okay, so that's why I personally think it's not a proper way. So another common improper way, I think, is to, like I mentioned earlier, is to combine the crude odds ratios from primary studies. Okay, you know, in observational study, the crude odds ratio or risk ratio is not reliable because it has not been adjusted for confounding, right? So this is actually the same as this issue. No control for confounding. I think that's not appropriate. Okay, but another way to do it, which I think is better, is proposed by the, I think it's AHRQ of the United States, the Agency for AHRQ for Healthcare Research Quality. Okay, it's proposed by that agency. So how this way to do the rating is like this. For a study to have a good quality, the study must got 3 or 4 stars in the selection domain, and 1 or 2 stars in the comparability domain, and also 2 or 3 stars in the outcome domain. That means for every domain, you should get some scores. Okay. No missing, no low rating in any domain. Okay. And then ideally, you should get like full marks for each domain, and that will be a high quality, a good quality, right? Otherwise, even if you got full marks for the selection domain and full marks for the exposure domain, you got 7 marks, still it could be a low quality study. Okay, so this is the rule proposed by the AHRQ which I think is, I mean, slightly better than the previous version.